Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. And today, we're actually sitting in the JPPI offices, which is something that I don't do that often when it comes to recording an episode of the podcast. But we're doing this as I'm joined here by Dr. Shlomo Fischer, who is a senior fellow at JPPI. And we're here on the occasion of the publication of his new book, Expressivist Religious Zionism. I'm reading off the cover, Modernity and the Sacred in a Nationalist Movement. So first of all, Shlomo, congratulations on the book. I have a bunch of questions, and I've been skimming and looking at the book. But first of all, I do have to ask, what does expressivist mean?
Okay.
Because simple people like myself don't necessarily know what that means.
Expressivist, I didn't invent the term. It was invented by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. But what it refers to is a way of thinking that centers on self-expression. Mm-hmm. A way of thinking that this self-expression can refer to an individual. It can also refer to a nation. It can refer to a collective group of people. So the claim of the book, the most general claim is that the culture of religious Zionist people, who many other scholars and other people characterize as fundamentalists and things like that, I'm in contradistinction to them. The book I argue, that what's really at the center of their thinking and their lives is this notion of self-expression.
Okay, so I want to talk about that in a moment, but first let's just back up 1 second. And religious Zionism movement in Israel, which Israelis would refer to as people who are affiliated or come from Dati communities or Dati Leumi communities,
Correct.
National religious communities.
Correct.
Give us some basic details, breakdown. How many are there? What's the composition? Where do they lean politically? Because we're going to talk a bit about politics as well. Like, just give us kind of set up the baseline for
Okay,
us.
so the religious Zionists are, for the most part, almost entirely Orthodox people. And they, at the same time, identify with modern Jewish or Israeli nationalism. They make up between 12 and 16% of the population.
So about 1.6 million people, 1.5 million people.
Something like that, right? And they've become very prominent recently. We had a prime minister who was a religious Zionist,
Naftali
Bennett. We had head of the police. We've had other people like that
We've had a head of the Shabak has been,
of the Shabak,
and
absolutely.
even Herzl Halevi, the current IDF chief of staff.
He comes from a family
that is national religious.
He's careful not to identify.
Right, but he himself went to a national religious high school.
Absolutely,
right.
and so did Benny Gantz.
Yes, that's true.
So we have this is a sector which is small in size but very, very prominent and very influential. Mm-hmm. They are very well represented in the middle class. They're very well represented in the academy, in high tech, in other endeavors, and of course, they're most well known for having led the settlement movement since 1967, or since really 1974, in the West Bank and in the Greater Land of Israel, what they call the Greater Land of Israel, what some other people call the occupied territories.
Right. Now, in the book, you do kind of touch upon the fact that a lot of people look at this movement or look at this stream of Israeli society and see it could be, maybe you'll tell me it's because of the politicians who supposedly represent them. People like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, which I'm assuming are names that our listeners and viewers might be familiar with. But what you are trying to make the argument to some extent, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the so-called Messianic extremism that is often associated with the religious Zionist movement because of their role in the settlement movement. They were the founders and the pushers and the backers and the ones who, did everything to convince the labor governments and then the Likud governments to allow the establishment of settlements throughout the West Bank and then Gaza. And now again, some of them are advocating for new settlements in Gaza. That it's not really just about fundamentalism and religious extremism.
Well, right. So when people wanted to classify or explain who these people are, what are they about in the late 80s and in the 90s, so the term and the concept fundamentalism came easily to them. This was following the revolution in Iran. It was following the creation of Hamas. as the Islamic Palestinian resistance movement. So there became a religionization of the conflict, and people naturally thought that these people are the Israeli wing
Interesting.
of that religionization. The best way to explain the relationship to Messianism, or to the redemption, as they call it, they don't really talk about Mashiach. They don't talk about Messiah. They talk about, if anything, they talk about redemption. And
I'm thinking as you're saying that they talk about the Geula, right? The redemption, but the redemption does mean the Messiah. No. Who's redeeming us?
They think of it as a gradual historical process, and the best analogy in the West and Western thought is Marxism. And the two ways of thinking are very similar. They both talk about gradual processes in history, which proceed dialectically. Now the dialectic is different, but they have this in common.
So just to explain, and tell me if I'm wrong, the gradual process is what they often refer to, or some people refer to as Itchalta de Geula. Am I saying that right? Which is like that the state of Israel, the formation of the Zionist state of Israel in 1948, is the beginning of the redemption process.
So again,
which is a process.
Absolutely. But,
right.
Again, one of the things that the book concentrates on is that this stream itself is riven by internal debate, conflict, argument, etc. So some people will say, well, the state is the framework of redemption. Other people will say, it's a stage. We're going to go past the stage to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So,
which might be the more extreme elements within the movement.
Correct, but this is debate, an ongoing debate. I mean, and an ongoing, it was very strong in the 90s and leading up to the disengagement from Gaza, and now it's less strong. And now there are other issues. We'll come to those, to the issues that. But I'm saying this is a community which is very active, very vibrant, very chiyuni,
critical. Important for society.
Yeah, and fermenting. It's always, it's
so that's kind of like the theological, to some extent, foundation for the movement. And of course, there are people like Rabbi Kook, Avram Isaac Kook, who's like one of the fathers of the philosophical and theological base for the religious Zionist movement. And of course, it changed over time, and his son was one of those big pushers of the settlement movement
and of the redemptive significance of the state of Israel.
Yes, right. But you mentioned the disengagement, and there were, if I think now, there are two pivotal moments in recent Israeli history that were moments of crisis for the community.
Correct.
The first was the Oslo Accords, to some extent, the 1993 peace agreement that Yitzhak Rabin signed with Yasser Arafat, which was supposed to see the establishment of a Palestinian state and an eventual withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, a.k.a. the West Bank. And, of course, you already mentioned this, the 2005 withdrawal from the Gush Katif settlement block and the Gaza Strip. That changed the community, these two events, to an extent.
Well, they developed tools, and this is where the first, how shall I say, divergence occurred in the community. They developed tools to deal with this. And the two tools that they developed, one is called the Mamlachti stream, and Mamlacha in Hebrew. Ben Gurion, of course, is famous for Mamlachtiyut, is statism, in other words, the importance of the state. And this stream very much emphasized, there's a Talmudic saying about the redemption, that it comes little by little. Mm-hmm. And the notion was that it's a natural process. It's a gradual, natural process in history, driven, of course, by divine providence, but it occurs through natural means. So, of course, there are setbacks, just like the stock market. It goes up, it goes down. The secular trend, if you take from 1929 to today, so the secular trend on Wall Street has been up, but it's, it had crashes, it had retreats, it had this, everybody knows that. So that could serve as a sort of an analogy for how they think of the redemption. You know what I mean? That it's the secular trend, the long-term trend.
So all the Oslo pull out from Gaza were all Just
blips.
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 Yes.
Yeah, blips.
Little stumbling blocks along the way
Correct.
that will be fixed.
Correct.
And just fast forward to now, that's where these people now calling for the resettlement of Gaza see this as the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Understand. But I'm talking more, okay, I understand the blips, but it did lead to the branching out of more extreme elements that we didn't see in the past. For example, you have, and I hate to use this term, but this is just the catchphrase of it, the settler violence that you have in places in the West Bank.
Correct.
Which, I hate the term because it makes it seem as if we're implicating all settlers, but that is just the term. But the Jewish extremism, and just
so let me talk about that.
Yes.
Let me talk. Well, so the first elements of Jewish extremism really surfaced in the early 1980s with the Jewish Settlers Underground, and that was a response to the peace treaty with Egypt and the withdrawal from Sinai, etc. And that was a complex movement in itself. But let's say the more extreme ideological edge of the movement had an idea very similar to the idea that the Arabs had, or the enemies of Israel had, to October 7th. Let me explain that. Mm-hmm. The extreme idea was, by Yehuda Etzion, was to blow up the Dome of the Rock.
I've met Yehuda Etzion.
Okay.
Yes.
He's an interesting guy.
I was actually with him. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was with him on the day in the settlement called Morag that used to be in Gush Katif.
Okay.
When his son was pulled out, he was there. And I spent the day, I wrote a whole story accompanying the family throughout the day. He's quite the character.
Yeah, he's right. Right. He's a talented guy.
Yes. Smart guy.
So in any event, so his idea was to blow up the Dome of the Rock and to galvanize and energize the people into the redemptive process. Mm-hmm. Now, that didn't work, and he didn't in the end blow up the Dome of the Rock, and he was arrested before that. He probably wasn't going to do it anyway, but there was enough explosives on Temple Mount to do it if they wanted to. But the Shabak, the General Security Service, foiled, and okay. But you can see the power of that idea from what happened on the Palestinian side on October 7th. The Palestinian side, instead of by this victory over the IDF and over the State of Israel on October 7th, the invasion of southern Israel, the massacres, the fact that they were in the settlements.
By the way, that they called, you talked about the Temple Mount, they called the Al-Aqsa Flood.
Al-Aqsa Flood,
yes,
right. That galvanized, in fact, that's what we saw. That was the idea. That was Yehuda Etzion's idea on the other side. That galvanized the Palestinian movement and galvanized support. Instead of people condemning the rapes, the murders, the burning people alive, the killing babies, etc., people, pro-Palestinians in America and in Europe, right, became energized in favor of the Palestinian cause and put the Palestinian cause on the map. Mm-hmm. So extremists think alike on both sides. I mean, in other words, that the idea of a really violent action will not bring condemnation, but on the contrary, will bring support.
Interesting. But this this movement, this extremist branch, let's call it.
Okay, yeah.
You see it. Yeah, it plays out with some of that violence that we see occasionally in the West Bank, where the Israeli government should do more. Okay. But you are seeing also politically the party right now in the Knesset,
correct,
which is referred to as the religious Zionist party led by Betzalel Smotrich.
Correct.
This is not the Mafdal, the national
certainly
religious
not
party
it's certainly
of what once was.
Okay.
Very different.
Okay. So let's talk about that for a second. The Mafdal, the NRP, the National Religious Party, which was formed in 1956, people started to notice it changing in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And that's when it went from a sort of satellite movement, at least that's the way it appeared in public, a satellite movement to the ruling Mapai. They're always
the Labor
Party,
right. More liberal,
more. I don't know if they're liberal, but they were left-wing, socialist, whatever they were. So more Western in any event. So they were sort of a satellite movement. All of a sudden, and this is already, I deal with this at length in chapter 2 in the book. The religious Zionists who grew up in the state of Israel, not necessarily born in the state, some of them were born in the state, but they all were social, they all grew up, they all went to school in the state of Israel, they, for the first time, said, we can take a leadership role. We don't have to be a satellite to Ben Gurion or to Menachem Begin or to anybody like that. We ourselves can try and take a leadership role. And then they ask themselves, well, okay, so what are we saying? What's our program? What are we saying? And then the 6-Day War happened. Mm-hmm. And it crystallized that we're going to talk about settlement of the land of Israel.
But sorry to interrupt, but one thing that interesting happened, and here I just want to stop you, is for a movement that was different, right? If you go back historically, so the state, the Torah, and the land, they became very focused on one issue, the land.
That's not true. That's
a misconception.
It's a misconception. I mean, it's a polemical misconception. In other words, people who say that are polemicizing. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't say. I'll give you an example. In other words, like I said, the state of Israel is the vehicle for redemption, and that's why at least one branch was willing to swallow Oslo, the disengagement, et cetera, and not budge on its. They're also, they're very concerned with the people of Israel. And, they're very concerned with the people of Israel, and really their whole program, and that's why when Naftali Bennett was education minister or minister of religion, he set up this special unit for Jewish identity. So you can say, Jewish identity in the Jewish state, what is this about? I mean, in America you can do, everybody does Jewish identity, but in Israel, what everybody's, by definition, Jewish. They live in the state of Israel. No, what they mean is by Jewish identity is that they should be in touch with their inner authentic selves, everybody, the entire population, and then wish to embark on this redemptive course of settlement of the land of Israel, of etc. So from their point of view, they're very much concerned with
But what happened politically? That when I look at the Knesset today,
What happened
why did the party that supposedly represents the movement become so radical?
1 second. Today or then?
Today.
No.
And it's not just today. It's the last 10 years, let's say.
No, it's much more than that. I mean, in other words, let's put it this way. When the old generation, Dr. Burg, people like that, these are people who were active until the 80s. But when they left the stage, then really the NRP, then it was still the NRP, adopted this program of settlement, redemption, etc. Also, now they were, like I say, many of them were deeply committed to the state of Israel. Many of them were deeply committed to relations with the general population, wanted to influence it, but they also saw themselves as part of it, etc., etc. Now, what happened in the last 10 years, let me talk about what happened in the last 10 years. What happened in the last 10 years is that the religious nationalism that was, let's say, central to their ideology became widespread. In other words, that you have large sections of the population who aren't traditional religious Zionists, they're not Orthodox, etc., who will tell you that they are national religious. Mm-hmm. And this is a process that's parallel to what's happening in the United States and parallel to what's happening in Europe, which is that you can be a religious nationalist and not be religious in your private life.
Interesting.
And the two
because it's more of a nationalistic movement.
And the people who embody that more than anybody else
are
Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Each of them in their private lives
are not religious, but have embraced the religious people.
And have embraced the religious definitions of the United States.
And they're I mean, in Israel, you have a coalition. His coalition partners for Netanyahu are all religious.
They're all religious.
Donald Trump doesn't need a coalition, but his supporters are very religious.
Correct.
Right. I want to use the time that we have left to talk about what's happening right now.
Okay.
The movement, the national religious movement, the DTI movement in
Right.
Israel, is really also in a new crisis to some extent.
Cor-
Because on the one hand, I don't know if it's a crisis of faith, but it does have political consequences. It might have faith-based consequences. But you have a disproportionate number of soldiers who have been killed out of the 800 plus soldiers that have been killed since October 7th.
Right.
Come from the DTI schools, DTI communities, settlements, in a number that is far beyond their 16% representation of society. And this has to do with a lot of different factors, but the push that they go to combat units and the desire and the motivation, the high motivation to serve and to enlist in the reserves. But there are just so many cases of story after story of a father of 9, a father of 10, a father of 6, and it just goes on and on and on. One high school, Himmelfarb, where I went to high school, 10 kids already. There was a funeral last week of Tal Shoham, I think, was his name, who was killed in IDF service, and one of the teachers from Himmelfarb said to someone there, "We already have a minyan in Har Herzl, in Mount Herzl. There's already 10 of our graduates." This is something that is changing to an extent. Also, part of this community.
It's changing beneath the surface. Let me say one thing, that the settlement movement started not in 1968 and 1967. I mean, there were Kfar Etzion, but it was very minor what happened right after the Six-Day War.
Right.
When did the settlement movements really start?
After the Yom Kippur War?
After the Yom Kippur War.
1973,
1974, right.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened. That was a result of a similar thing, that for the first time, the Hesder Yeshiva students and the religious were on the front lines and suffered heavy casualties as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, everybody knows that in Beit HaShita, in Kibbutz Beit HaShita, they lost 11 members in the Yom Kippur War. In my yeshiva in Kerem B'Yavne, we also lost 11 people out of 200. We had 50 casualties out of 200 students.
Wow.
11 dead and 40 wounded.
Mm-hmm.
So, and out of that came the settlement movement. Out of that, the whole experience of the Yom Kippur War, of being thrown back on yourself, of having nobody to rely on in the outside world because of the oil embargo, if you remember that. And this
I can't say I remember because I was not yet around.
I remember.
But yes.
I remember. And this experience of we're thrown back on ourselves and our own resources, and then we meet on the battlefield our authentic selves, that informed.
So what do you anticipate happening?
So now what I'm saying over here is well, the first thing that's happening, even it's not even below the surface, it's on the surface, is this break with the Haredi community.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, and I've heard it.
Who have been their coalition partners and their
Correct.
natural allies in
Correct.
government for years now.
For years, correct. And and Smotrich still thinks in terms of this trade-off. We'll support them, that they won't go to the army. They'll support us on the on the settlement movement in the land of Israel, annexation, etc., etc. But that is increasingly becoming untenable in the national religious community. People have said to me, we go. I ask my Haredi cousins how they're doing, and they say, great. I go from, my grandchildren all getting married. I go from wedding to wedding, and that the lady in question, who is very religious, I know her from my synagogue, she said, they go from wedding to wedding, and we go from funeral to funeral. Yeah. And that's a fundamental chasm in the experience of these people. Now, what will come of this, so you already can see that it has political implications, because the representatives in the Knesset and in the government, like Smotrich, who would like to continue the alliance with the Haredim and that, well, I don't know what's going to be in the election, but all the polls say that he's below
the threshold.
He's below the threshold.
Yeah.
So there is something going on. Now, how that will manifest itself is unclear to me. I just let's put it this way. I keep on thinking about, what there was a German writer in the 1920s and 30s, Ernst Junger, who wrote about the experience of World War I. And he said that national identity is forged on the experience of combat together. Mm-hmm. That, of course, had implications for the...
That were not necessarily good.
Not necessarily
well, we
good.
won't talk about those implications, but I do understand. So the crisis on the battlefield, or the tragedies that you face there, do lead to
But it also
something.
means a new alliance with the general population that does serve.
Yeah, interesting.
Including the center and the left that does serve.
So basically what you're saying, Shlomo, if I understand, is that expressivist religious Zionism, this is only part one.
That's
There's
right.
a part two that is still to come.
Absolutely.
So congratulations again on the book.
Thank you.
Mazel tov to anyone who's interested. Expressivist Religious Zionism, Modernity, and the Sacred in a Nationalist Movement by Dr. Shlomo Fischer. As always, you can find the book on Amazon. You can find it where books will be sold, but you can also find the podcast, as always, on Mondays and Thursdays, where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and, of course, the Times of Israel's website. In the meantime, have a good week.